On a ketogenic diet, people still tend to think that fruit is going to operate a little bit differently within the body, meaning that they're okay to have some fruit because it's not a typical carbohydrate. So the reason that I wanted to do this video was to A, help clear up some confusion surrounding fructose and glucose metabolism, but also to help give you an idea of some of the fruits that you can consume on a ketogenic diet, even if it's just in moderation. You see, generally speaking, people tend to look at fruit a little bit different. Sometimes they put it in an entirely different box as far as carbohydrates are concerned. They think because it's fruit or because it's natural, that it's not a real carbohydrate and that it won't affect them on a ketogenic level. However, it's actually quite the opposite. Fruit can affect ketosis significantly more because it hits closer to home as far as the liver's concerned. Hey, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can get all of my videos and know whenever I'm posting a new vid. Also, make sure you hit that little bell icon so you can turn on notifications so you know whenever I go live, but also so that you never ever miss an awesome video. All right, so when it comes down to ketosis, one of the cardinal things that we have to remember is that ketones are produced in the liver. So anything that is affecting the liver is going to have a dramatic impact on our ketone production. And fructose is metabolized predominantly within the liver. I'm going to explain all of that in just a second. So we have a couple of different carbohydrates that we usually consume. We have good old-fashioned glucose, and then we have fructose, which comes from fruit. You see, glucose is used by virtually every single cell in the body. Whether you're in ketosis or not, every cell has the capability of utilizing glucose. Now, on the other hand, fructose can only be metabolized in the liver. Fructose cannot be used by every cell in the body. Fructose can really only actively be processed and metabolized within the liver. So right then and there, it hits closer to home as far as ketosis is concerned. So whenever we consume regular carbohydrates that are not coming from fruit, the liver only has to take about 20% of the brunt of the load. But when we're consuming fruit, the liver has to take 100% of the brunt of the load. And when it comes down to restoring what's called liver glycogen, the carbohydrates that are stored in the liver, it's a lot easier to store carbohydrates in the liver from fruit than it is from other carbohydrates. And when it comes down to producing ketones, we need the liver to be completely depleted of glycogen, or as close to it as possible, in order to produce the maximum amount of ketones. Now keep in mind here, since glucose can be used by every cell in the body, when we consume glucose, we have an ability to burn it up really fast. But since the body can't use fructose, whenever we consume fructose, it has a tendency to get turned into free fatty acids and triglycerides and ultimately fat significantly easier. So whenever we consume carbs, our body takes glucose, again, the simple sugars that come from regular carbohydrates, and it strings them together. And it strings them together into something known as glycogen. And then it stores them in a couple different places. It takes them and it stores them on the shelves within our muscles, within our skeletal muscle system. And then some of it takes and it stores within our liver. But there's two distinct jobs. You see, the skeletal muscle tissue does something different when it's glycogen than the liver does. The job of the glycogen or the carbohydrates that are stored in the liver is simply to maintain blood sugar. We're trying to keep our blood glucose levels elevated enough so that we constantly have enough energy. Now, when it comes down to the muscle glycogen, those carbohydrates that are stored are used only whenever we're exerting energy for activity. So, for example, if you were to break into a sprint and you needed energy, you'd pull it from the muscle tissue. But if you just needed regular blood glucose levels to be elevated for traditional life, you'd pull it from the liver. So what ends up happening is once we burn through all the liver glycogen, all the carbs that are stored in the liver, our body has the ability to produce ketones. So you see a lot of things out there that say you have to go through your entire carbohydrate stores before you ever start to burn carbohydrates. And even though there is some truth to that, it's an overgeneralization to try to make ketosis make a little bit more sense. In reality, all you have to do is burn through your liver glycogen first. In fact, even when you're in ketosis, your levels of muscle glycogen are still elevated because you're not really tapping into them unless you're doing heavy weight training or high intensity interval training. So you're really just trying to burn through the liver glycogen. But knowing that, we're always topping off the tank with fruit, and we're never giving the body the chance to actually create ketones. Whereas if we were to consume regular carbs, those are generally going to a different tank. So we have more of an implication that can occur as far as stopping ketone production by eating fruit than we do by eating straight up sugar. I'm not saying you should do either one. Now, when it comes down to the actual metabolism of fructose, it's pretty interesting. And I'm going to give you an overall analogy to help it make some sense. You see, fructose ends up using something called facilitated diffusion. It uses the active transport chain and it takes in sugar in a completely different way. So I want you to imagine for a second that you are consuming at the same time a strawberry and a little bit of pasta. Okay, what's going to happen is the pasta has glucose, the strawberry has fructose. It's going to enter your mouth the same way, then it's going to go into your digestive system, and when it goes into your small intestine, it's going to reach a point where it needs to absorb. Well, at this point, I want you to visualize two buses, okay? The glucose from the pasta is going to get on one bus, and the fructose from the strawberry gets on a completely different bus. But that bus only has the ability to store a few molecules of strawberry. It's a smaller bus. Okay? The bus that the glucose can get on is big, and it can carry a lot. Okay? The small bus goes straight to the liver. The big bus goes throughout the rest of the body and delivers glucose and does some other things. So you can see at that point how it's actually metabolized entirely differently within the body. Now, there was actually a study that was published in the Annals of Nutrition that put this into an interesting perspective as far as exercise is concerned. What they wanted to look at was how did fructose compare to glucose when it came down to post-exercise and actual recovery. Well, it was pretty interesting. See, after 2 hours, they found that a little bit of fructose actually did allow a little bit of skeletal muscle recovery, but glucose did the bulk of the work. But after 4 hours post-exercise, they found that almost all the fructose had restored liver glycogen, but hadn't touched muscle glycogen. Therefore, meaning that if you were to eat fruit post-workout, you're not even stimulating your recovery. You're adding it to the liver, and that's about it. So if you're on a ketogenic diet and you were to suddenly just eat a bunch of fruit post-workout, you would be much more likely to kick yourself out of ketosis than if you were to just have a couple grams of regular carbs. Again, not saying you should do either or. So let's get to which fruits you could have in small amounts on a ketogenic diet. And let me say this as a preamble to all of this. You don't need to have fruits. Okay, I'm doing this video because a lot of people say they truly miss fruits. Okay, the first one I want to talk about is going to be avocado. And some of you are going to turn off the video right now and be like, this is a joke. Avocado is a fat. Well, here's the thing. Avocado is a fat, and it's higher in fat than it is in carbs, but it's still technically a fruit. And the sugar or the carbohydrates that are in avocado are fructose. So have you ever noticed that if you're having a bunch of guacamole or a bunch of avocados, that your ketone levels might read a little bit lower? Well, that's because that fructose is going straight to the liver. So you don't want to go overboard on the avocado. In fact, I usually recommend no more than one whole avocado a day while you're on a ketogenic diet. Okay, then the next one we can talk about are going to be blackberries. Here's the cool thing about blackberries. Overall, the net carbs are pretty darn low. We're talking 6 to 7 grams of net carbs in about a cup. Now, overall, you're still going to have 15 to 20 grams of carbohydrates when you count fiber and you count some of these other things. But what I want you to realize is that you could have a small amount, maybe a quarter cup or so, without ever having a problem. You might temporarily stunt your ketone levels, but since it's so low glycemic and has such a high fiber content, it's going to absorb slow enough that you shouldn't have too much of an issue. So then we've got raspberries, which are in kind of a similar ballpark, right? They still have that same slow digesting metabolism that's going to allow them to be broken down a little bit slower. They still have a high amount of fiber, so it's breaking down a little bit slower, but again, they still have the fructose that's going to contribute to liver glycogen. So we want to keep it to about a quarter cup. Again, nothing crazy, but if it gets your sweet tooth satisfied a little bit, it's better than loading up on a bunch of artificial sweeteners. Then we have strawberries, same ballpark, except strawberries you can go a little bit higher because there's a little bit higher water quantity. So since there's more water in them, of course, the sugar is going to seem a little bit less in terms of volume. So you can have maybe a half a cup or so of strawberries, but make sure that you're not slicing them so that the surface area isn't compacting and you're ending up with ultimately more like a cup. Okay, now I want to clear one thing up before I wrap this video up too. Okay, insulin is not always the issue. Okay, when we look at fruit and we look at carbohydrates in general, we always say, oh, it's going to create an insulin spike, and we're not going to be able to be in ketosis because we're secreting insulin. Not always the case, okay? Insulin is not the end-all be-all. We still have levels of insulin that are elevated even on a ketogenic diet. If we look at a type 1 diabetic, for instance, the reason that a type 1 diabetic could ever go into ketoacidosis is because even when ketones are elevated, if they don't have insulin to allow those ketones into something, then you end up with ketoacidosis. So we still need insulin. So it's not the fact that the fruit is causing an insulin spike. It's more about what's happening in the way of the liver glycogen and what's happening in the way of how the liver prioritizes metabolism of certain things. If fructose is coming in, then the liver has to prioritize metabolism of that and not creating ketone bodies. As always, if you have ideas for future videos, you want to learn a little bit more about the foods you can and can't eat on a ketogenic diet, make sure that you comment below and let me know, because this is how I learn what kind of videos I should create, what kind of videos are going to be the best performing topics here on YouTube and also on other channels. So keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you in the next video.